So perhaps we should begin at the beginning, or at least our beginning, partially for conceiving this conference. Some would describe this moment, this sort of public present, as a moment of growing calls for decolonization. And we wonder if you would open by reflecting with us on this moment, because this is really also what is driving the conference, right? Which is, what does this moment, what does this current conjuncture mean for rethinking art history, institutions, museums, universities, and really what role is there or do you see for artists in this moment of rethinking and of reckoning?
Oh, wow, that's a question. I'm really skeptical of the institution, quite honestly. I think until there is an institution that, I mean, it depends on the kind of institution you're referring to. I'm very particularly skeptical of academia institution, just due to the model that has been set up here, at least in the US, of it being more of a business model. So I'm completely skeptical. And the horror stories I hear of overworked professors. So I just kind of I prefer not to teach for that very specific reason. As far as institutions in the museum realm, again, very skeptical, particularly here in the US with the George Floyd murder and the constant PR of, we support Black Lives Matter, but no support of their staff, no support of artists of color, no support of paying people fairly, no support of paying their staff fairly, no benefits, overworking the curators of color. um, so I'm very skeptical in that sense, unless I have a very personal relationship with the curators that are part of those institutions that actually feel that there's actually any real institutional change. I just recently had an issue with an institution that tried to whitewash my work and not make it visible that I was Black. Um, Misidentified me ethnically, tried to sort of change the dynamic of the work that I make and completely change the narrative. And I see how easily that can happen. So I think that artists, we have a lot of power, but I think we need to stop thinking institutionally and think about, I don't want to say guerrilla style, but other means of making work outside of these institutions that were not built for us. This the whole construct of an institution like a museum was basically the colonizer's trophy case. So how can you really expect huge change in that when that structure still stands, and you have all these institutions acquiring or still acquire work of other cultures that doesn't belong to them, and their reluctance to return the work is rather interesting to me. It's like an open conversation that needs to happen. I think Belgium in particular is an interesting case of them feeling like the Congo didn't have the resources to take care of their own history, which is like a really bold thing to sort of say, like, you're not capable of caring for your own history, you know. So yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly as an artist what I can do other than bring it to light.
But if it perhaps we could, if we see this current moment, then Andrea, as a moment of anxiety, a moment of concern, of a certain kind of criticality, it might also be conceived as a moment when the fallacy of the institution has become most present, most evident. That the institution itself has come under so much critique, and actually perhaps in recent years has been running after itself to be able to imagine a new kind of future for it, right? For itself. There has always been critique of museums and universities. However, there might be something about this moment of the now where, for me anyway, museums seem to be trying to reorganize themselves to be relevant for a different kind of future.
Which museum in particular are you speaking of? Because not American museums.
It's good that no.
I'm very pessimistic, particularly because of the George Floyd situation. We saw here in the States, there was a huge goal of like hiring all of these curators and professors of color. And that was great. It was fantastic to see, but then there was no support for those curators or those professors, and the overworking and like what that does emotionally, the emotional labor that those curators and professors of color take on is not something that's openly spoken about, which is an issue that I have, because they're left to be the representative of everything non-white, everything colonized, and that is a lot to expect of a person to take on by themselves with no kind of support system, no funding. And I think, the conversations that I've had with friends that are professors and curators who feel like, yeah, it's great, they brought me into this, high profile institution, but then they don't give me the support that I require in order to make this happen. Or you're dealing with a very conservative board. Like the Whitney is a very great example of a board that, had someone who was, a manufacturer of like warfare material that was being used in Palestine and here in the border, here in San Diego, like shooting tear gas over the border to keep these migrants from coming in. And it wasn't until people protested that that person was removed. But that's not to say that the other people on the board don't share the same beliefs as that individual. They may not have, questionable means of income, but their politics is very conservative and not, if they weren't conservative, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
I want to come back to this though, because I think, Anna, but I still want to mark the moment coming back to this. I am probably a little bit older than you, quite a bit older than you, sorry. But in a certain sense, one of the things that strikes me though, in the museum context anyway, that the scramble to try and understand how we can sustain ourselves. This is the first time I've seen it in the way that I've seen it more recently. Uncertain about, even recently there was a meeting in Prague about museums defining themselves and coming with a new definition of what a museum is. And even in that celebration that they don't know what we are, there is a question about what are we and what are we for? But I want to come back to that. And let us have a little bit of joy, Andrea.
I'm a pessimist.
What's that?
I said I'm a pessimist.
No. Pessimism. I'm not a. I tell people I need an optimist or pessimist. I don't know what the words mean. I don't know what it means to be an optimist. I think it's a useless idea, optimism. But I do believe that one needs to fight to create different kind of futures, and that is what I call hope. That fight. Yeah. But let us talk a little bit about your work. And if we could, so let us have a little bit of joy in your artistic practice to learn a little bit more for the viewer what animates the work that you do and how you would describe your own practice in relationship to this current moment of thinking around the undoing and redoing of a certain kind of institutionality. So first, your practice. What animates you?
I just have a joy for making and understanding how things work. For every project that I take on, for me, it's always about learning something new out of it. So whether that be So I've made quite a few cyanotypes, but I didn't, I'm not a photographer. So for me, it was learning the process of making those images. I built a dark room out of a half bathroom in my house and put paper on my toilet and dried the paper in my shower and then, prints on my porch. Really DIY. And I like the practicality of this is not something that you need to have a sophisticated lab to do. You don't need sophisticated equipment. My chemicals are $24. Like anyone can take up this stuff and do it. And I kind of I like using the mundane objects or using materials that are very affordable to anyone to express themselves in that way. And I think that was my original fascination with like working with foodways and sugar in particular, and sort of like investigating the things that we take for granted and the power and that they have and how they shape the world. So a lot of it is discovery and keeping the fun and the joy in the practice is always like learning something new and like adding that tool to my toolbox so that if there's a concept that I have that I can just like whip it out at any moment and make this object or this thing. Like right now I'm making sculptures out of paper pulp, and I've only done it maybe like once before. So it's a whole new challenge taking these large three-dimensional objects and sculpting them out of paper, and my dog going and chewing them up and destroying them and having to do it over again. But in some senses I'm learning to I always feel that those things happen for a reason. Like I kept saying that my dog was my best critic because she would destroy it, and it would suck. Like it just sucked before I completed it, and she made me go back and like really have to rework the piece and find a better way to construct it. So I kind of just go with what I get day by day, like what I kind of, as my husband says, annoyingly roll with the punches. And that's kind of how I approach my practice in a lot of ways. I just have a joy for making things and making objects and an appreciation for labor, um, down to I just got my nails done yesterday, and I watch the women as they do my nails. Like it's a skill set that I don't have, and I appreciate the labor that someone can do that I can't do. Like I have a real passion for learning the day-to-day of people's lives and the labor that we take for granted.
Anna, you have a follow-up or go
Well,
ahead.
no, I was gonna say, I love that idea of the DIY aesthetic because I think it also chimes quite beautifully with what you were saying earlier around the sort of these sort of spaces for guerrilla kind of interaction, and I wondered whether that sort of process um, that you're describing, and also your real interest in materials, is that something that you try and create a space for audiences to engage with too, so that they're sort of in that space of learning and process with you?
I've done a few things. I did a piece on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn for the Labor Day parade. Um, I took a lot of the images that were distributed through tourism, like a lot of images of like half naked women, things like that, and sort of repurposing those images with text that has been used to promote tourism and taking those things and juxtaposing them with what was actually happening on the street. And so we wheat pasted, I had some friends come and we wheat pasted these images all over Brooklyn and sort of like contrasted them with other advertisements that were in Brooklyn on the Parkway. And hearing people's initial response to them is always great. My audience is not academics or artists. My audience are like my parents who don't care about art, don't know anything about art. Like they're not interested. But I feel that if I can communicate with them, then the work is successful. Because I'm not making art for art's sake. I'm making work to tell very real stories that are identifiable by people who don't necessarily have an art background. I mean, I love what I do, but I also don't take it super seriously, in the way that some some artists do. You know, like as an adult, I've only lived in the hood, and I would love for my neighbors to be able to like enjoy the work as well. I grew up in a sort of middle class area, but my entire adult life I've lived in one hood or another. So for me, it's being able to communicate with the people that I see on a day-to-day basis, that I live with, tell their stories, show how we can relate to one another. So that's, I think that really is why I work with the materials that I do, that they're things that anyone can just pick up and make something with. It's not, I'm not special in any kind of way.
That's beautiful. Thank you. You are special, but I think that's also just a beautiful. It's actually for someone who is an academic but struggles in academia. It's really very affirming to hear you talk like that. Actually, about what your work does and who it's for and audiences and I mean, if it's okay, can I ask another question, Wayne?
Yes, yes, of course.
Well, just about, I mean, it's something Wayne highlighted earlier, too, with this interest in labor and the way you were talking about your relationship with communities, neighborhoods, families, and I wondered, I mean, was that interest in labor? How does that work both as a process but also as a theme, and how does it kind of intertwine with the sort of familial legacies that you talk about as well in about
I
your work?
try to I try to honor the labor of others, by the by my own labor. So I never mean to do this, but I always end up taking up a very laborious project that is very time consuming. It's like, not to disregard painting because that is also very laborious, but I just did a piece for the Ford Foundation where I made this, gigantic bird nest. It took like 4 months to make, and it was very physically painful. Just constantly bending over because I was like weaving these baskets in order to make like a gigantic weaver bird's nest that sort of talked about the migration of people into the island. And when I was there, I found weaver bird nests that were made out of sugarcane, and I thought that was rather ironic and interesting. So I decided to make this larger version of it, and this idea of sort of taking what you have and kind of creating a community with it. But the physical aspect of making it was something that I had never done before, and it's the largest sculpture I've made to date. Um, and it was just painful to make. Just my back was killing me. I had to work in a chair that had like a vibrating thing, so that just my spine was like on fire, and it required like a village of people to help me complete it. So all of that, all of the physical that I put into it is my way of honoring those who have labored as hard. And my labor is nothing compared to what they've done. But as an artist, the first thing that people always ask you is, how long did it take for you to make that? So if you can sort of like talk to people in a way that they'll ask that question, but then if you like talk about, well, these people labored for X, Y, and Z amount of years in order to get out of a contract, you can kind of put it in perspective for people so that they can sort of like re-examine what the cost of labor can be. And I think I never mean to start that way, but everything that I do becomes that tedious, like from cutting things out repetitively to beating, which has taken like a strain on my eyes. Um, I do it just because it's a conversation that I'm interested in having about the amount of physical labor, and that like this labor is nothing compared to, somebody who's, you know, doing construction work, or, somebody that's a garbage man that's coming in this heat, coming and picking up trash and dealing with all of that. So I like to sort of juxtapose those two things, especially because the work ends up being in a white cube. How can I make that inviting for people and, bring it down to a level that is accessible to everybody, and not necessarily just made for a very particular audience. Like I have no desire to like make work specifically for, a high art institution. That's That's not my goal or my audience.
As I hear you speak, and perhaps this was also my own interest in the question of labor, it recalls, for me anyway, why we wanted to do this conference in this particular way, to ask the question about the Caribbean and what does the Caribbean do to help us to think differently about the writing of art histories, but also just think differently about the disciplines in which we are embedded. Today I met somebody of Jamaican descent from England, and we were talking about the revival tradition in Jamaica, that religious tradition, and a part of really the revival, which is regarded as cutting and clearing, which is about the labor of clearing the colonial, of moving through the struggles, of creating the space. So can you say a little bit about how, in what ways, if the Caribbean informs the work that you do, or the way you do work, or the particular kind of interest that you have, including something that Anna just said about honoring a certain kind of kinship with others, what is the Caribbean for you in that sense?
It's home for me. I mean, my grandmother was part of the revival.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of funny that you brought that up. You know, and like she was also a Garveyite, and yeah, initially a lot of the work that I was interested in as far as labor was like looking at her labor in particular. You know, she would go to Coronation Market and she'd start simply with like eggs or limes and sell those, and then move on to like the next big thing and sell that, and that was how she took care of my siblings. I mean, my father's siblings. And you know, they worked at a very young age. I think one of my uncles opened up his first shop at like 15 or 16. So work has always been, I think, especially when you come to the US from another place, like work is always the number one thing. You know, this idea of, work will elevate you to the next level, this whole like pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And I don't really believe that that is so when you have to think about institutional racism, and you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps as much as you want, but that's really not going to change anything. You're going to hit that, glass ceiling no matter what. But for me, I feel like I'm going home. Like when the airplane is like about to land and I can see the water, it feels like home. And I feel like I can be me without having to answer a bunch of questions about the last name and things like that. So for me, Jamaica has always felt more like home than Trinidad has. I think just the access that I've had to Jamaica has been a lot easier than Trinidad. But it's more wanting to tell my family's story, and for me it was trying to understand why my family is the way that it is, the dysfunction, the motivations for certain people, the thought process of why things are the way that they are, just to better understand myself, but also to pass this down on to my own child so that he has knowledge of who he is and he can easily access this stuff the way that I was not able to. A lot of my father's siblings don't choose to talk about their upbringing because it's too painful, because the amount of labor that was required of them in order to just survive. They lived in a tenement yard for some time, and they all worked at a very, very young age. Their father did not encourage them to go to school, they were to work. So work and labor has always been a huge storyline within my own family. And on my mother's side, my grandmother was a midwife. So, that's a whole lot of labor. But she was loved for it. And I'm also fascinated by her as a caretaker and laboring for others out of like the goodness of her heart. She was so well loved that when she became ill, people took care of her. They paid for her medication and things like that. So I don't feel like an American all the time. I feel like an American when I travel to other places, but I don't feel like an American. So um, for me, there's no way for me to not have a connection to the Caribbean. Like that is my story that really defines who I am as a person. How I see the world is very much shaped by my background and how I fit into this realm, this world. So there's no way that I cannot connect to the Caribbean in any kind of way. Like I would make an effort to try to go every couple of years just because I felt like I needed to be there. There was something about it that was very healing for me to go and just sit in the water there, particularly there, not anywhere else. Um, it's home. It's home for me.
And still, because one of the things that so I sit here, I'm in Amsterdam, and one of the things that excites me about your work is that you are one of the few artists that I know whose work, or academic actually, I know whose work tries to connect the Indian Ocean together with the Caribbean. So in a way, and within the context, and by the way, I hope you just noticed that I've just described you as an academic.
I was going to say something about that.
Yeah, but it is a battle space, an intellectual and museological battle space for us in the Netherlands to try and understand the question of slavery, of colonialism, not only in its transatlantic formation, but rather to connect that with what was happening also in the Indian Ocean. So
definitely.
I wanted, how did you come up onto that, and why? And why did you want to push beyond some people? I was in a conference recently when people speak about the dominance of the Atlantic in our imagination as it in relationship to questions of the colonial and slavery. So how did you come to that, and why?
This is how much of an academic I am, right?
Thanks.
I was watching PBS here in and there was a show that I really liked called Globe Trucker. And like the woman was on an island and I saw, a man who was black and he had locks and I was like, oh, they must be somewhere in the Caribbean. And she said Mauritius and I was like, where the hell is that? And I had to look it up and I was like, oh my God, they're so similar to us. And then I was in grad school too at the time. And all of my peers, grad school was very transformational for me. Like it really changed my life. And, I didn't think that I could apply for things until I saw my peers applying for things. And I was like, they're applying for a Fulbright. I should apply for a Fulbright. So I was trying to find a place that was, like there's definitely a strategy to applying, but it was either Ghana or Mauritius, and Ghana was incredibly competitive, but I was interested in the Jamaican population there. But then Mauritius was just like sort of like this outlier of, man, this place is really small and it's far. And at the time, I had been making a lot of work with with spices and things like that. And that was sort of like my interest, like looking at foodways and how things ended up in certain places and how it tells a larger picture of migration. And then Mauritius, when I looked at the food, the cuisine was so similar to the Caribbean, like dal puri, what we call roti skins. Everything was the same, but different. The Chinese that came to the Caribbean, Hakka, are also in Mauritius as well. So there were so many similarities that I was like, this seems like a really ideal place to go. It's far. And like, realistically, I was like, this is government money. Let me see how far I can go. Let me see far I can go with the government paying for it. So that was my interest. It was to go there and really to see the connection of how someplace so disparately far had so much in common with the Caribbean, and to learn that with the Indo community, that Mauritius functioned as a depot, as the experiment before people were spread out through the Caribbean. They came into Mauritius first, and there's actually really fantastic records of all of these Indian indentured laborers that came into Mauritius first and then were dispersed out through the Caribbean. So Mauritius was sort of like the guinea pig of seeing how all of this labor could function together. And it had been colonized by so many different countries. The Dutch were the first to colonize it, but there are also people from the Malay Islands that had established established places there. And then after the Dutch could not seem to make it work and killed off all the dodo, then the French came, and they were slightly more successful. It's why the language is predominantly Creole and still French. And then the English came. So the story is exactly it's so much like the Caribbean, and they've looked to the Caribbean for inspiration as well. Like if you look down to the music, Sega is the music in Mauritius, but they've created Sege, which is a mixture of like reggae and Sega. They look to Bob Marley as like this hero, and they have their own version of Bob Marley named Kaya, who was tragically killed by the police as well. So there's so many similarities. Coolitude, shows the relationship between Mauritius and Trinidad, that you cannot deny that there's some shared interests there. I think they look to each other. At one point, I remember reading that Jamaica was looking to Mauritius as an inspiration to sort of become this cyber island in some ways, the way Mauritius has. They both have, a relationship with India and China as well. So, it's been kind of interesting to see that shared relationship. And when I was there, I stayed with a former Fulbrighter who had married a Mauritian, and he was Hakka. So, he taught me a lot about things that my grandfather never shared with anyone. So I got to eat like Hakka food, and, he took me to all of these different Hakka events that happened. I learned how to cook from him and some of his sisters. And, it was just a really, it was like the best year of my life. It was awesome. Like, I just ate for like a year, but learning so much through that food and that eating and the history that carried was quite amazing to see. So I have such an affinity for Mauritius. Like I would love to be able to go back there, because the relationship between Mauritius and the Caribbean is so strong that it's kind of it feels so comfortable being there. I didn't have to answer about my ethnicity or anything like that. Like, we passed as Mauritians. So it was just a really fascinating experience, and I love telling the story between the two regions to show the similarities of what happened there, and what happened in the Caribbean as well. Those are stories and connections that can be built.
Go ahead, Anna.
Were you gonna say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. No, I felt like that when I went to Jamaica. Actually, it was, I remember seeing flowers that grew in my grandmother's front yard in Sri Lanka, and talking with maroon communities there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, the same spices. And it is this. I think that's what is so, kind of goes back to what you said at the beginning, like our colonial condition, right? It's as if we're constantly somewhere else as well as being where we are, and it's this kind of I'm not sure, maybe something like a sort of multiplicity of seeing that I think your work really opens up, and in terms of bringing the Indian and Atlantic Oceans together. But I think it's also something about the Caribbean where you can't really ignore this sort of inheritance or effect of colonialism.
It's interesting to see how it's affected each colonized space differently, you know? I keep thinking if we could just all come together and be this big superpower, just take over, that'd be awesome.
Well, it's something that I think it's different in sort of like colonial countries like Australia, for example, where the connection's always been to Britain. But now I think actually more people are thinking about the Indian Ocean as a site of other connections, and again thinking about the sort of expanded form of the Caribbean, seeing how different ideas and capital and people moved from the Caribbean to Australia even, and were part of that, part of other forms of enslavement in Australia. And so I think that there's something about yeah, as you were saying, right, about this kind of this sort of opening up, but also looking to those looking to the kind of oceanic as a kind of conduit that allows these other perspectives or other orientations maybe to emerge, which is so powerful. And I mean, and again, that's really something that when I first saw your work, it was as if you sort of materialized a way of seeing that I couldn't quite articulate. It's the way that you're able
I
to.
can't quite articulate it all the time either. So
But it's like that seeing two or three spaces at once that I think is really powerful, that kind of emerges in works like Crowning, or that I think is really powerful.
I think there are just so many things that were identifiably similar when I was there. I'd be like, oh, this is this. And then, my friend would correct me, no, that's not. But there were just so many similarities that it was hard not to sort of like, misidentify things. I mean, even down to the flora, like there's things there that you see. There's a tree called Pride of Barbados. They have that there and they call it, it's something like a fire tree or something like that, which was fascinating to me. I was like, oh, that's Pride of Barbados. But also understanding that plant also was used by enslaved midwives to perform abortions, like in both locations. And the fact that like that knowledge was shared in both locations, like that's really fascinating to me to see um, that knowledge was dispersed in both locations. Even like calling, in Jamaica, Maroons, they're a very particular group of people that are in like Akapong. But in Mauritius, there are also Maroons, and it's a more loosely description of those who like escaped, but some of them were Malagasy. Some of them were, East African from like around Mozambique area. So it's just a broader use of the term, but very similar, and very, very similar in the senses of like escaping, enslavement. And there were some Malagasys that actually like built boats and tried to go back to Madagascar, and either survived or didn't. And it's just fascinating. It's just really, really fascinating.
No, in the conversation around this was with two curators. I think it was who had invited me around the Indian Ocean, thinking the Indian Ocean together with transatlantic conversations. And it was, I think, Bonaventura Kong from Cameroon were living in Germany, German, and another curator. And I remember in that conversation feeling a little bit irritated because it felt like a conversation about we have looked too much at the Atlantic world, and now we should stop and start looking at the Indian Ocean. And that wasn't their intention, but it just felt like that.
I think that's a bad way of having the conversation.
Precisely, and that is precisely what I see in your work, that it invites us to ask a different kind of question about what is the yield that can be gained by looking at them together, both in terms of thinking more analytically about questions of race or fugitivity or even transplantation and movement, that your work does that for me more than in the competitive economies of which one helps you. So it was, I must say that I'm very excited by seeing you're teasing these things out as a conceptual togetherness.
I'm not interested in the suffering Olympic Games. Like when people, oh, I suffered more than you. No, we suffered more. Like, we all suffer and we all deal with trauma. So like, I don't see the need to compare that. Oh my gosh, my phone is blowing up. I don't need to see the comparison. No one's pain is above anyone else's pain. So if we can have a conversation from a place of pain and we can heal together and deal with our trauma together and really point the finger at who is the cause of that trauma, I think that there would be a lot more unity. I think that there could be a lot more connection and a lot more interesting stories that could come from that, a lot more of like, building, intellectual building, community building, art building. Like there could be so much more that could come from that than just wanting to see who suffered the most. Like we all suffered in some fashion.
I have a last little thing here though, because I want to put you back in the academic room.
As long as PBS like defines me as academic, it's all good.
Yeah, PBS, we'll thank PBS. But I still want to ask, and perhaps this is my interest and not yours, so you can just tell me to go away, but what are some of the themes that you think the two registers of your work on the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, what are some of the themes that you think are specific to those spaces and the conditions, the pressures of those particular spaces that emerge from your work that you think are urgent for this current moment? We are trying to rewrite the history of anthropology. We're trying to think about what do we teach students, of art history, anthropology from my section. What do we teach students in that first survey course? We're trying to think what a curriculum could look like otherwise.
I think it's very interesting that both regions have come from a service economy. And, and they're still in the framework of a service economy, service providing, agricultural needs of those with a sweet tooth. Like, I mean, it is really that ridiculous. Like when you think about it, like the craving, sugar is a drug at this point. But then, turning from that sort of service economy to tourism. And I think that seems to be a very lasting thing of a lot of, if you look at a lot of the islands that have been colonized, their only resource really is to turn to tourism. And it's just like, why is that? Like, I think that that's a question that should come up, and who also forces them to sort of be in that situation. Like, I think that's a Life and Debt, that documentary, I think really stays with me. And it was sort of like the inspiration for all the work that I have made. Someone put me onto that when I was in grad school and just really inspired the work, even the personal work and investigating how I could see myself within that framework. As far as an anthropology course, oh my gosh, I don't know how to set up a curriculum for your students. But God, I don't know how to answer that question. That's really hard. That's a really hard question. I don't know how I would begin to teach that course. I don't know if maybe I would start from, maybe the unknowable of what was originally there. What was the landscape like? How did we shape the landscape in a way to suit our needs as opposed to the needs of what was already there? Like Mauritius had no indigenous people there. And why is that? Like what made it inhospitable for human beings to be there as opposed to human beings being in Madagascar? If we're thinking about all of the, the continents all having connected at some point, why was it that chunk of land had no inhabitants in it? I would be curious to see the relationship of like these untouched locations and see what they shared prior to, the invasion of human beings. I think a lot about like colonialism in terms of what's happening now with like the space race and like people trying to colonize Mars and the moon. I'm like, have you not learned anything historically? Have you not learned anything? Um, it's I can see the fascination that people probably had then of going to these foreign places, of not knowing, and the curiosity, but not really taking into consideration the impact. Like I would love to have seen just exactly what the human impact was of those places prior to settling. We killed off an entire species in Mauritius. Like, what else did we kill off in Jamaica? What are the possibilities of what it could have been had we not we, clearly, because I'm not white, but had people not invaded and like just abused the land in the way that they did, reshape the land, brought all of these things that were not natural to the islands there. I think people sometimes forget that what we attribute to being, Caribbean or even, island life isn't necessarily natural to those places. Like mangoes are not natural to Jamaica. Breadfruit is not natural to Jamaica. All of those things that we attribute to like going home and eating, but that's not the way it was. So I'm just curious to know what the land was like. Like how can you anthropologically do those investigations devoid of the human touch? What would that look like? I don't know,
Nice.
you find some
Yeah.
like weird dinosaur that lived there at some point. I don't know.
Nice.
Tough
I know.
question though.
No, but it's nice. I mean, you tease out already the question of indigeneity and what is that? How do you define it? But also an ongoing conversation for me, because in the register of global scientific practices and also kind of policy practices, we use words like invasive species to describe breadfruit or whatever. And I always, whenever people used to say that to me when I'm in Jamaica, I always say to them, but I'm invasive as well. So the dinosaurs are dead.
I mean, like I think about that all the time, that I think we are the worst invasive species. We take over everything, we dominate everything, we destroy everything. I mean, it's going to be 103 this weekend. That's all us. That's our footprint on the world. I definitely think we are the worst invasive species. So like when I see, it's funny, my husband works for NASA, so I have a huge interest in what's happening, but at the same time, I'm like, no, don't go to Mars. You could come back and bring some disease and we're all gonna die. like if you think COVID was bad, could you imagine what a Martian flu would be like? But like I don't think that people are thinking in those broad terms of, our impact on the land. And I think we see ourselves as this elevated species that doesn't do anything harmful to the world, but like we're the worst out of, it's not like dolphins are going around and like randomly killing people or, causing oil spills and stuff like that. It's us. It's us, and we are the invasive species. So what can you do to be, responsible? But I also I heard something recently on NPR which I thought was kind of interesting. Do you know what a boll weevil is? It was this pest that invaded cotton.
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Yeah.
Very
I love
hard
that
for
result.
them to produce cotton and to like harvest cotton. And I was like, all right, boll weevil, like the invasive species was revolutionary for Black folks here. And like in some ways, like there are situations there are creatures that in some ways have been very helpful to certain populations that have like, if we could eradicate cotton, what would the face of the US be if that had destroyed the entire cotton industry? Like that would be transformative to what this country looks like right now. So like I think about invasive species in that way as well. And the language that's used to talk about invasive species is also the same language that's often talked about with immigrants. So, it's really fascinating to me to like look at and examine the language.
And sorry, go ahead, Anna.
No, the only thing I was going to say is that it seems like, oh, hi. I haven't met you yet. You're beautiful.
Mine's cool, but
Yeah, I keep muting because mine are running up and down the stairs into the attic right above me. No, I was just going to say that what you were saying earlier, Wayne, about the sort of competition and of institutional spaces. And Andrew, you said at the beginning, like you're not sure what role your work does in terms of institutions. Just listening to you talk with Wayne here, to me, it seems like what it is that you do is you change the position, change the orientation, so that um, it's about seeing these connections, which I feel like often institutions and even art history itself, because of how it's set up, it almost can't be anything but take on this kind of role of comparison or comparing. Just think of an art history lecture, right? Compare and contrast, or how how things kind of do end up being about they're value driven. They become hierarchical in terms of as you were saying, the Olympics of suffering, right? But so it's just it's I think that's a really important, to me anyway, it's a really important space that you create in order to make those connections that I think, and perhaps this is what you were asking earlier, Wayne, that institutions, academia is still not able to do that yet because of how it's set up, how it's structured into these sort of geographies or teleologies.
I think it's also not just like location, but I think and I can say this because I just recently had an experience. Like I was supposed to be setting up a residency for a college, and the competition even between departments, I think, is also what limits the ability for these conversations to happen. Like academically, I think everyone is competing for the same funding in order to do this research, and it's like, well, how can you find similarities if you know you're competing for the same little bit of funding that's not even enough, to be quite honest. And I think that that's another reason why some of these conversations don't naturally like generate between the two. And so things like institutions, academia, all of these things end up feeling very separate from one another when we're all really speaking about the same thing. And I am a pessimist, but could you imagine what it would be like if we could just focus on the similarities and the connections that we have, as opposed to like fighting with each other or boxing everything in this way, which to me feels like a very sort of colonial thing to do, is to just like segment everything and put it into these categories, break those categories. They're unnecessary, and like think about where the origin of that comes from. I think we just kind of buy into it at times as opposed to like really questioning it.
Yeah, I think that kind of aesthetics of or a sort of affiliatory aesthetics or aesthetics of affiliation is what is really beautiful that you're describing. I think. I mean, I don't know what that's like in anthropology, Wayne, but certainly I feel like thinking about what art history could be differently if that was the model is, I think, could be quite transformative.
I'm curious, do your anthropology students work at all with any other departments? Like, it would be interesting if they worked with artists or like.
No. Yeah,
design.
no, but to be honest with you, that just slipped out. I work in a museum that with an intellectual history from anthropology, but my day-to-day work is with people who work in history and art history and all of the other disciplines. So I describe myself as disciplinarily promiscuous. So that is my that is my analytical lens. But in a certain sense, though, I mean, the one of the because I understand what Anna means. I mean, a lot of the work that I do in from my perspective is around questions of togetherness, of care, affiliations, that kind of thing. So I think that even in the disciplines, relationality, those questions are being raised. But I wonder something else though, because how might we, Andrea, so for somebody like me who say all the time that we think from the Caribbean, we think with the Caribbean informs our intellectual outlook on the world, sometimes that can sound a little bit rosy and sweet, and the Caribbean is wonderful and everything there.
No, you really think that? I don't. I don't think it sounds rosy and sweet. I think it sounds complicated.
Okay, no, okay, then let's go
For
there.
me, it sounds complicated.
Let's go there. Yeah. And what is the complication? What is the complication?
Finding your place in the world. I think, how do you define what it is to be of the Caribbean? I always distinguish that I speak from a Caribbean American voice because I didn't grow up in the Caribbean. So my conversations are always from someone who had the longing for home but was stuck in this hideous country. So, that's my interpretation of it. I can only speak from that. Like I definitely don't think that everything in the Caribbean is rosy at all. Um, if anything, it's a bit heartbreaking at the challenges for me that I see people have there, and the sometimes the limitations that come with being of the Caribbean. But I don't know. I don't think that sounds rosy in any kind of way. I just think it sounds complex because that's what we are. We're complicated people. We're not like chilling on an island eating a beef patty or whatever. Like that's just not us. Like we have real life challenges. Um, we're exploited. We have all these foreign entities that come in and buy up all the property, and then people who live on the island can't even go to the beach. Like I think that there's some real significant issues, like how COVID sort of like ravaged parts of the Caribbean. We can talk about that, but we could also talk about how the mortality rate of Black women in this country are the worst than any sort of quote unquote developed country, and how like the midwife system in Jamaica is highly more functional than the way that Black women have their children here in the US. So it's complicated. I think that there are amazing things that come out of Jamaica or Trinidad or whatever. There's like great things that come from the Caribbean. It's just complicated like any other place. Sometimes I wonder if it's better for me to be there than it is to be here. It's hard. Like I definitely don't want to be here. But it's like, where do you go? Every place has its thing, and you have to be able to deal with that thing.
In many ways, I mean, I'm not I'm gonna hide behind my academic persona. We don't have to think about what things are like in the real world, right? No, I do, because I've also just taken on a curatorial position as well. So it's something I think about a lot, and I'm having to think a lot more about. But in many ways, I think for me, as someone who's in art history and African American studies, so I have this sort of interdisciplinary position. It comes down to a lot of like what we were talking about and how we were talking. I think that sense of creating space, or thinking about the work that we do as a space of gathering and affiliation that is also about accessibility and as you said, like that kind of DIY aesthetic, but it's about kind of expanding what who is speaking, and where that that knowledge or cultural production can go in. It's to me that's a start, you know, and that's very vague. But I think that's something that I think institutionally it's something we talk about, but it's actually again an orientation and a framework that's really difficult to implement, because it's what you were talking about before about where we kind of are encouraged to start in terms of like our little space. And
I keep wondering what action looks like. I think that was one of the issues that I had with a lot of the museums when the whole George Floyd thing happened. It was just a lot of in solidarity, we support you, but I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing? You know,
yeah,
what are you doing? So how I just keep wondering, like, what can institutions sincerely do to produce this kind of change that we theorize through many symposiums and conferences, and like, you know, we could talk ad nauseum about it, but like I wonder what actual, you know, what an action list would look like for an institution to make those changes, even slight changes. Mr. I run an institution. I would
yeah.
Yes. No,
love
but
back.
it's good that it's good that you said this though, because to answer your question, first of all, I started by actually going back to some of the things that you presented, because in a certain sense, your last statement for me is why I wanted to do this conference. That by some strange mode of its formation, the Caribbean seemed to emerge a certain set of questions that trouble us. It troubles us conceptually, it troubles us practically in our day-to-day life, but it troubles, for me, the foundations on which many of the disciplines we inhabit um, are based. And therefore, I want to have this conversation because, for me, the very question of what does indigeneity look like is a question that one needs to ask. How does one understand questions of temporality is a question that the Caribbean emerges. What does extinction look like is a question that the Caribbean asks you. What might it mean that my number 11 mango, which is the best mango ever, actually really came in a box from India with the label number 11 on it, and so it got named number 11. But that it becomes a space where even the category of what Deborah Common speaks of as primeness, or the category of purity, or whatever David Scott speaks about, this must be imagined differently. So to ask this question about the Caribbean in relationship to disciplines and to practice, I think is to ask the question, a place so confounding might help us to imagine our disciplinary work differently. So that's one thing. But the other side to you is that I don't believe in institutions. No, I think institutions are not trustworthy. I think they are impossible. But the museum isn't going anywhere. And the university isn't going anywhere.
The foundation, like, you know,
Yeah,
how do you work within that? How do you turn it on its head? Like, how do you mess with it?
So the question then is, what analytical or practical skills do we adopt to be able to make them at its least less violent, at its least, and at its most a space where we can imagine flourishing. So that is, and that's why I said to you that I didn't steal it from him. I had it first, and then I read him write it, and it sounded better when he wrote it. But so this is Terry Eagleton. That I'm not optimistic. I don't believe that. I believe that is such a useless concept to say, oh, if you look at it differently, it will be better. No, it won't.
It's interesting you say that because as you were talking, I was thinking about, when you had asked me the question at the very beginning, I was like, I don't know how to answer this question because I feel like when you are constantly in the face of institutions that refuse to change or change in increment, like slightly incremental steps, how do you dream? How can you dream of what it would practically look like to make a change? Like I don't have that ability to dream in that way. And I think like I agree with you with the optimism. Like I don't know how to dream that because I've seen the face of so much just like shut down, like, not no effort, condescension. It's very hard for me to dream in a way of what would that look like. And in
No,
some ways that hinders my art
But I
making.
no,
think
yeah,
it's powerful too. I think that's really powerful too, Andrew, as because I think the same thing's happening in art history, right? Post George Floyd, every department has a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Of course, I'm on my departments, and it's all about we can do art history differently, and in fact, I don't think that's true at all because of what art history is. It's completely it's a colonial discipline that sustained so many processes, and so I mean, I think um, as Wayne was saying too, it's not something that can be changed. But I think what something like this conference or these questions about the Caribbean does, and what your work does, is make us realize that, right? It brings that into the foreground, and I think to me that's very powerful because it means people have to accept or at least acknowledge that, because it's not something that is acknowledged, right? That there's always this, oh, but we can do something better, or this sort of optimism, as you've been saying. So to
I
me,
want to
it's
share.
powerful to state that actually.
I want to share one last little thing though, because so Kirk Franklin, you know Kirk Franklin, right? Kirk Franklin, there was this in the 1990s that was, if you look back on the video, it is such a old-fashioned look. But in when Kirk Franklin came out with that joy, joy, God's great joy, and in the beginning of that song, the organ plays wonderful, and then the Kirk Franklin invites everybody to do that first joy. And in that first moment, there is a small break when the music is so sweet that the choir just laughs. You see that moment of laughter, Andrea and Anna? It's for me the moment of hope. It is a moment of decolonial joy. It is a moment of imagining an impossible possibility. And that's nothing to do with optimism. It has to do with fighting.
Yeah.
It is. I'm trying to say that I have no optimism for the institution.
I think that's a very shared.
Yeah.
I don't think people are honest about it, but I think that is actually how people feel. They're just not openly honest about it, and I think that is the whole problem with the institution is the lack of truth telling. If we could just be honest about the reality of what it is, then I think we would be honestly in a better place. If we could be honest about history, then art history would be probably a popular class. If we could be truthful about these things, we could be truthful about history, I think that we would be more engaged, and societally we'd be in a much better place. Like I think that if you're truthful, there's room for forgiveness. But if you're going to continue the lie, then there's no reason for me to believe anything you say, anything that comes out of your mouth, anything your institution puts out.